Hello, John from the Lib Dem Podcast here. We are delighted to say that this episode is sponsored by Praetor Reigns. Now more than ever, you need a professional-looking online presence and website. Praetor Reigns have been helping Liberal Democrat campaigns succeed for 18 years. Their Lib Dem Foci package combines a website, social media and email system to help Lib Dems win. You'll receive great support from real people, fair pricing and a huge range of features to choose from. Praetor Reigns are already the bespoke developers for Lighthouse, Lib Dem Draw Online and the LD Directory. They combine a talented system design with an unrivaled understanding of our party, our data and our systems. To find out more, check out the Praetor Reigns website at praetorreigns.co.uk/liberal-democrats. Now, on with the podcast. Hello and welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast. My name is John Potter and I'm back with Lisa and Laura to talk about all the stuff that's going on, and the breaking news that's happening right now is actually the vaccine has been approved. So this is great news for everyone. This is the first of the vaccines as well, isn't it, Lisa? This is the Pfizer one. And so, is this light at the end of the tunnel now, Lisa?
I think, well, let's hope so, John. I got slightly emotional when reading it this morning, that the end is possibly in sight for this really weird, awful period of all of our lives. And I think I've certainly not had the lockdown that some people have had. You know, I've got space to work. I like spending time with my partner and my dog. And, you know, my income has stayed fairly stable. But it's just been an awful period for so many people. And I think if there is light at the end of the tunnel, it can only be a good thing.
What about you, Laura? I mean, obviously the vaccine is, of course, welcome. When do you think the timeline's going to be? When do you think normality might start to appear?
I think it depends on the approval for the other vaccines. So I think for this vaccine, it's the Pfizer one, which is has to be kept at minus 80 degrees C. And, we don't have enough doses for everyone to have it. But, actually we can give it to healthcare workers and some of the most vulnerable people, especially the elderly. So I think a lot of easing of restrictions will be possible, even if this is the only one approved. But it's also quite likely that we'll see some of the others approved, especially, for example, the Oxford AstraZeneca one that has probably a lower effectiveness rate on the basis of the figures that have been released. Although there's this possibility of having more effectiveness with different dosage regimes. And if that one is approved as well, that one's much easier to distribute, and we have many more doses available. So, you can imagine if that one's approved this year as well, then we could be sort of getting back to normality sort of as early as kind of March of next year, I would have thought.
And we talk about normality, but I think there's going to be scarring. I had a conversation with my local authority's chief finance officer yesterday, and he talked about the scarring impact on the economy and the scarring impact on the council budget. And if you suddenly take however many thousand people from employment into unemployment, that has an impact on the whole community, whether you're one of those individuals or one of those families or not. Just one of the things on vaccines, they only work if people take them, if people go and get them. And one of the things I really, really, really hope the government has got planned is a massive education campaign about why this vaccine has been able to be developed so quickly, much more quickly than other vaccine programs, because that leads people down all sorts of Facebook rabbit holes, questioning and getting confused about things. And so being really clear about why scientists have been able to do this, why civil servants have been able to go through the bureaucracy side of things much more quickly than normal, I think would be a good thing.
And I think we've got to be prepared. Sorry, go on, Laura.
I was going to say also, there's actually quite a lot of evidence on kind of how you roll out vaccination campaigns and how you encourage people to be vaccinated. And you're absolutely right. There are a lot of people that will have sort of vaccine hesitant or anti-vax views that need to be will need to be sort of challenged through the government comms campaign. But actually there's also things like making sure it's easy for people to be vaccinated. And you can even consider if you have communities where there's transmission and when there's where people just aren't doing it, then you can even consider things like small incentives for completing the vaccination campaign, and those have been shown to be very, very effective in all over the world, really, in increasing vaccine take up and increasing the number of people who complete the course. Because one of the big problems is people will often come for the first vaccine and then just not quite get round to getting the second vaccine. So it's just making it easy for people, and just thinking about looking at the evidence and referring to the evidence in planning the campaign and sticking with that, and as we roll it out. And I think from that you'll get quite a good take up, I would have thought.
It is interesting because we have a new campaigner that's joined our team, which is fantastic. He's getting involved in politics. He's going to stand for election next year. And he had his first residence phone call today. And he rang me back and said it was an anti-vaxxer guy. And I said, look, they're not all like that. You will get odd people calling you. This is the nature of politics. And the guy was kind of a conspiracy. It's a plandemic, to help out the pharmaceutical companies. And so it is, because it made me think about smallpox, and it made me think about whether, as liberals, we would be always against any sort of compulsion with vaccines, because this vaccine has no animal products in, so it's okay for if you're vegan. Obviously, there are some religious groups that have nothing to do with any sort of vaccine, but on the most part, most religions should have no problem with this because it contains absolutely no animal product at all. Would be any level of compulsion ever considered from you guys from a liberal point of view? So
I'm actually quite gung-ho on this, to be honest. It's probably my least liberal view, is that I really believe that if you're a Jehovah's Witness, you can't deny your child a life-saving blood transfusion. And I don't think you should be able to deny your child a potentially life-saving vaccine either. I think when it comes to adults, I would be quite opposed to compulsion, although, if private businesses don't want to let in people who haven't been vaccinated, then that should be up to them. But I think when it comes to children, we should be a lot more robust in general when you look at the lifelong effects that getting infected with something like measles can have on a child. Then, even before you start thinking about herd immunity, then it just, I just find it horrifying that because the state has an obligation to protect children and their right to health. And are we really doing that if we're not giving them the opportunity to be vaccinated and allowing their parents to opt out for reasons that, that may not be valid?
I think it comes back to the harm.
If there are health reasons, obviously that's completely different.
Yeah. I think there's the harm principle, isn't there? I think you should be allowed to make decisions about yourself and your own body, and that's something that all of us would fight for, people's bodily autonomy. But I think it's when you're then taking decisions for other people that then puts them at risk, then puts them at harm, that I think that the state does need to step in. We as a society needs to step in.
And I think Laura's touched on a point there. That's probably key. I mean, there'll be a point where businesses and employers will say, look, you have to, if you want to be here, then you have to, we can't risk our other employees. You'll have to show that you've had the double dose of vaccination or whatever. And that will be as bigger incentive as anything, as well as the education side of it. I mean, there'll always be people like Jeremy Corbyn's brother or something like that who won't like it, but that hopefully, like you say, we'll get to a point where then herd immunity kicks in, and then we get this thing suppressed enough that normality starts to come down. This podcast has been sponsored by the Katora Coffee Club, the UK's most environmentally friendly coffee club. There are over 400 independent roasters in the UK, each one crafting coffee in their own unique style. Katora Coffee Club works with some of the best to take you on a voyage of coffee discovery. The Katora Coffee Club delivers ethically sourced and independently roast coffee directly to your door. Each month you'll receive between 2 and 4 bags of coffee and their monthly extract magazine. With Christmas around the corner, their gift boxes are a perfect present for the coffee lovers in your life. Even better for Lib Dem Podcast listeners, use the code BETTERCOFFEE to save 5% on subscriptions and gift boxes for a limited time only. They also have a number of V60 gift sets worth £8 to give away. All Katora Coffee Club boxes are carbon negative and offset the CO2. So why not do some good, enjoy some great coffee, and check out the website www.katoracoffeeclub.com. Now, back to the podcast. Brilliant news about the vaccine, but it's been a grim 24 hours for the retail sector. And a big fan. It was Lisa that said about economic scarring, and the brutal nature of this virus has just businesses that were already struggling, like Debenhams, like the Arcadia Group. This has now just completely boshed them out of the park. And so, what's now left for our high street, Lisa? I mean, where does it go from here?
It's something that communities are struggling with across the country. And you're right, the pandemic hasn't caused this, but it's just accelerated, I think, the real challenges that high street retailers faced. I think if I look at my own community, there are some small independent traders who understand their customer, who have a business that meets the needs of their customer, and they're flourishing. And they do that through a combination of online and offline sales, of doing events to bring people in, about really responding to what their customer might want in the future, but they don't yet know they want. Alternatively, you've got places, and I think like Debenhams, like some of the Arcadia Group brands, where it did look like the high street used to look, and it didn't reflect probably what customers want now. I think people who wanted that sort of fashion now get it online. And I think those businesses haven't responded necessarily in a way that's made them appropriate for what customers currently want. Aside from that, though, they're not to blame for the pandemic. The pandemic has meant that they have had to close. If you close, and you can get some support from the government, but it doesn't cover all your costs at all. So when you've got no income, but you've still got expenditure, those maths just don't work out for very long. And so it was, in some of these cases, just a matter of time. In terms of what the high street does, the high street across the country has to respond. It can't just be retail anymore. It has to be an experience. So it's much more coffee shops, libraries, museums, things to do. It's a day out on the high street now. It's not just go and buy some clothes that you need, go and buy some books that you need. It's about that experience, and that much more rounded experience.
Laura, anything to add on that?
Not really. I mean, I think one of the things I've been thinking about this morning really is that with Debenhams closing, especially, like I used to get a lot of clothes in Debenhams because it was one of the few places that had a good petite range. And I'm 5'2", and so actually, if I want trousers that fit me, like there aren't a huge number of places that I can get them. And Debenhams was one of the few places where you could kind of walk into a shop and like look for a dress or a pair of trousers that would fit you if you are short. And I imagine the same is true if you're tall, because clothes also don't fit tall people. So I suppose what I've been thinking about is, we were sort of promised that online shopping would bring us more choice, but in a way it seems to be bringing us less choice. And so actually I don't know, is it kind of out of whack somewhere? And is there like, I imagine that it will all adjust in the end, and you'll have kind of things like pickup points and, on the high street and things like that. But actually the fact that it is now much harder if you kind of want to go and buy something that day, it's becoming harder and harder to do it. And I've noticed this with kids stuff as well. When you had things like mother care closing, then the kind of, if you need some kind of specialist baby products that aren't available in the supermarket, it's not really obvious where you can go to just, if you want it that day. So if you're being organized and you can shop online, then it's fine. But also even then, if you want to be able to see the product, then that doesn't help. So it's kind of across the high street in general, we kind of seem to be ending up in a kind of, I suppose what I would call a sort of socially suboptimal place, where this isn't what we collectively would want if we could design it, but it's the kind of outcome that we're getting to. And is this something that will adjust in the long term, or is it something that is just how we live now and we all need to adjust how we live? Are there things that we can do that would kind of mitigate it? The sort of obvious thing is around reform to business rates, but you don't know if that's enough. And yeah, I think it will be, in 10 years time, I suppose it will all have shaken out, and we'll kind of see where we are. But I think at the moment it's a little bit depressing from a consumer perspective, and obviously especially so for the thousands of people who've just lost their jobs.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting because I mean there's a psychological marketing kind of point to an empty looking high street can really drag down an area, whether that's in a town or a city or whatever. And so And one of the big things, lots of people talk about business rates, etc., but also it's the high cost of rents. Now, if we're going to turn it into like Lisa said, into a more experience-based one, it's likelihood the turnover of an experience-based establishment isn't going to be as high as a pure out-and-out retail establishment. So it's the landowners might have to adjust what they can get as well, because they are key, actually. Because there's a lot of talk of, well, why doesn't the council reduce business rates, even if councils did have the money to be able to do that? And the question is, but that doesn't mean that the landowners wouldn't just offset that by upping their rents. So there's a real problem there that has got to be fixed in the long term about how landowners deal with these empty shops. But we'll wait again, like Laura just said, we'll wait and see. But we'll go back to some good news. We're kind of going good, bad, good. And we'll talk about, Lisa, talk about the success of Kickstart. ALDC Kickstart was at the weekend. And also, fantastic news, we've had a by-election again. We could look at by-election results on a Thursday and a Friday. Who knew that we missed it so much? And so we should just say congratulations to Liz and the Perth South team on a brilliant win, coming from third to beat the SNP. And if you've seen the previous episode, we have done with Liz talking about her campaign, but she also spoke at Kickstart, didn't she, Lisa?
Yeah, Councillor Liz Barrett, the newest councillor in Great Britain, came and spoke to ALDC's Kickstart on Sunday. So this was a big online training event that our colleagues at ALDC had put on. It was the party's biggest ever training event. They had over 1,000 people signed up. Most of the stuff was delivered by volunteers who were all supported by the tech wizards at ALDC. They posted some photos of the number of laptops they had open running all the Zoom sessions. I have it on good authority that there were 78 Zoom licenses purchased for the event. Some of the big ones where the plenaries were over 1,000 people, and so they needed the big boys and big girls licenses, but it was a massive success. There was a real buzz, and I delivered some training, did some mentoring. I wasn't expecting there to be the normal buzz that you get from Kickstart. My hangover was significantly less dreadful on Sunday morning than it normally would be at Kickstart, but there really was a buzz. There really was, people were excited, they were learning. It was much more accessible. So we said this about online conference. I had some people in my group who said, I just wouldn't have been able to come had it been a full weekend away from my family, whereas I can dial into this and I've got, kids playing board games in the corner. It works for me. And so I think we need to try and keep some of the good stuff from this awful year, because it's worth keeping. It really is. But it was a great success. ALDC should be really proud. Liz gave the introduction to Ed Davey, who gave the closing oration, and was on really good form, actually. But Liz was really interested in talking about what they did, how they won. Gotta love that STV voting system. And I haven't heard the episode that you've done with Liz, but I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot going on in Scotland at the moment as well, and some of it is really quite alarming. I mean, you had sort of Ian Blackford, the Westminster leader of the SNP, organising some kind of Twitter pile-on against a photographer who lives in Jamie Stone's constituency because he happens to be English. Like it's really quite, and really quite scary. And then they just had their presidential election, and there's this guy called Craig Murray who's this internet conspiracy theorist who, among other things, you might have seen, do you remember when the Skripal poisoning happened, and there was the kind of tweet going around that everyone at first thought was a joke, and then it turned out it was someone seriously arguing that actually the Russian poisoners were a gay couple involved in the illegal bodybuilding trade, and that was him. And a quarter of the SNP's membership voted for him to be their party president. And then there's this kind of manufactured row at the moment where the SNP have decided to give £500 bonus to health and social care staff, which is wonderful, but then demanding that the government make it tax-free, even though income tax is devolved, so they could just gross it up and they would get to keep the tax that's paid. It all feels like really quite, it's getting to definitely the scary stage of nationalism. I mean, I think we all know as liberals that nationalism sometimes has a cuddly face on, but there's always something scary underneath. And I think the cuddly face is is rapidly disintegrating.
Lib Dems in England sometimes think, oh, goodness me, Nicola Sturgeon's got some communication skills and we agree with her on Brexit. Therefore, they're our friends. And I think that is not the case at all.
No, that is not the case.
And looking at the transfer, and like you just said, Laura, the mask is slipping a little bit from the SNP. And actually, their record is coming out now. And it came out last week, actually, how they've handled COVID in some ways worse than even the English, I was going to say the English Parliament. That will get Lib Dems all a Twitter, won't it? So that Boris Johnson and the UK government has done that. Actually, some of the death rates, etc., in Scotland are worse. And actually, they made some horrendous mistakes, and not just with the COVID, but with education, and all this stuff is starting to come out. And then there's the Alex Salmond inquiry, where what did Nicola Sturgeon know and when? It's all kind of, and then there's all this internal battle with the Nicola Sturgeon side of it and the former Salmonites on one side, and it's all pretty grim. But what was interesting about the by-election results, and we talked a little bit with Liz on the episode, is where the votes went in the transfer. So, like I said, you saw a lot. I mean, it is only one by-election. It is one by-election, so you can't equate this up to the whole of Scotland. But, obviously the Greens, their votes tend to go more to the SNP than anyone else because they're also pro-independence in Scotland. But the Labour votes went to us rather than the SNP. There's still a fair chunk. And actually, weird enough, quite a few Labour votes went to the Tories, which was, it just shows you the intricacies of politics. But then what happened when it was a straight Lib Dem SNP in the final round? The SNP got, I think, 93 votes. The Lib Dems got 814. So that final chunk, which came from the Conservative first preference voters, massive. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in May. If Lib Dems suddenly become the voice of sensible unionism in Scotland, that might have some wonderful opportunities for the Lib Dems as well. But many congratulations to Liz, the whole team, and it was a fantastic pickup. We should get on with, obviously I've mentioned Boris and the UK government. The latest stuff is going on is the tier system. So we are recording this on Wednesday morning. So as of this morning, the tier systems have come into effect. I think we're all in tier 3. We're all in, along with, the great North and Midlands tier 3 debacle. So your impressions, Laura, on this? I mean, there's been a lot of grumps. There's a sizable Tory rebellion.
Yeah, I mean, I think they probably are quite doomed either way. And I think some of the kind of strangeness of the tier system is less strange now than it was before we went into lockdown. So, there was that thing about how you could, go to the gym in Lancashire and not in Liverpool, or was it the other way around? And something about car boot sales, like I can't even remember, but all of that weirdness is out, and we now just have one set of tier 3 rules and one set of tier 2 rules. I think the problem is at this point that everybody is so thoroughly confused that it's quite difficult for the government to then kind of break through to it. And I think it's also quite strange that they seem to be having this kind of argument with themselves that sort of ignores the fact that we now have strong prospects of a vaccine, where actually with a vaccine coming, this whole argument about do we live with the virus and force the economy to adjust and, et cetera, or do we kind of lock down and sort of just pay people to stay home, then it's, well, obviously we do the second one because there's a vaccine coming, so we don't have to do it for much longer. And they also don't seem to have addressed it. I think what I'm finding quite frustrating is that they don't seem to be engaging with why some of the previous slightly less restrictive systems haven't been working. Is it that we just need to be locked down in order to prevent transmission, or are there things that you can do? Localized test and trace is one that we've talked about, but also actually sick pay. The fact that a lot of people can't afford to self-isolate, they're just not addressing it. So, it almost feels like we're doing the same thing again, but expecting a different result. Although, having said that, we don't know if the tiering system really would have worked if they tried it a bit longer, because it didn't last for long enough for us to have that data.
It didn't last for long enough, and the comms were woeful and confusing. And I think one of the things about a national lockdown is it was much clearer for people what you could and couldn't do. And it didn't matter whether you were this side of the road or that side of the road, your rules were the same, and they were better understood. They also put much more effective effort behind the comms surrounding it. I think lockdowns work, that's clear. I think lockdowns that are better understood by people work better. And I think Laura's absolutely right to point out local test and trace, much more effective than the Serco test and trace, the clarity of rules. And I think the other thing that is still really difficult for lots of people to understand is why there's this massive sector of the economy, these excluded people, the freelancers, the people who've had no support, who still have no support. It's not as if the government doesn't know this is a problem. The point has been made loudly, clearly, repeatedly. And for so many people, it's just so difficult to get their heads around why there's this massive blind spot.
And we're talking about a year. Like, if we, even in a best case scenario where we're opening up the economy again in March, that's when we lock down. Like, these people would have been without support for a year. And like, how many people have enough money saved up that they could live for a year with no income? Like, what are people expected to do? I have to say that I have found the party's position on the tiering a little bit confusing. Like, the party, I think they abstained on the vote on the tiers, and then there was a kind of a press release around it which had kind of 5 asks in there, and I think some of them made a lot of sense. So there was the one about support to local test and trace, and about releasing the evidence so that we could understand why it wasn't working. But then there was also some stuff in there about pubs and a few other things, and I found it a little bit unclear, and I think the messaging around that just needs to be a lot sharper, because I think it's just so easy, especially when you're kind of voting with sort of some of the right of the Tory party against lockdown. You kind of have to be quite clear on why you're doing it, so that you don't just look like an anti-lockdown person.
So they were
and it just
not voting with the rebel Tories. So sorry, just to clarify, they didn't vote with the rebel Tories.
No, that's true. Actually, they abstained. But even so, like, I found some of that a bit confusing. Like, there was a thing about wanting to have outdoor, be able to have drinks without a meal in pubs in tier 2 areas, I think. Which I'm like, I just don't quite understand why we are campaigning for that, because is there evidence on that? I don't know. It just felt a bit strange.
It's always, I'm always reluctant, whether that's in the council chamber or on here. Abstaining doesn't absolve you of anything. It doesn't please anybody abstaining. And it's like, if you're going to abstain, you have to kind of say very clearly, like you said, Laura, what you'd do differently. Why? Otherwise, you don't want to be roped in with anyone else who hasn't supported it. So I'm not sure where the Lib Dems are going to go with this, but obviously the tier system is now in place, and like I say, hopefully the argument is kind of lessening because the vaccine's on its way. However, we should just talk about, because we talked about Kickstart, about what it means for people like us who are in tier 3 in the run-up to next May's elections. Because we're looking at the data, and you look at the reasons why you're in tier 3, it seems very unlikely that most of those areas that are in tier 3 now will be out before May. That's my reading. I know that might be me being overly negative, but I think it's probably unlikely we'll get there. So what does that mean from a campaigning point of view? And Lisa, as the chair of Federal Campaigns Committee, maybe you can just advise, just very briefly, on what local parties should be doing right now, given the tiering system.
Yeah, so we don't know when the tiering system is going to change. We don't know if people are coming down the tiers. Numbers generally, infection rates and things like that seem to be going very much in the right direction. But it's not just the infection rates, it's also hospital admissions and things like that. So we don't know, and it's out with our control to an extent, other than the role we play as individuals in all playing our part in this. What should campaigners be doing? So under national lockdown, the party issued advice saying people should not be knocking on doors. Campaigners should not be knocking on doors, but delivery could continue. Do your delivery in a sensible way, wash your hands, which you should all be doing anyway. Wear a mask where it's appropriate, stay away, 2 meters away, social distance, all of that. That continues in tier 3, but the ban or the guidance not to door knock is different in tier 3 and in tier 2 and tier 1. So I think use your common sense in terms of where the right places to door knock might be. So probably high-rise flats where there's not the ventilation, you're in corridors, you can't be 2 meters away. That's not the right place to go door knocking. But in lots of suburbia where people have got their own drive or doorstep or way of being 2 meters apart, knock on a door, move 2 meters back, think sensibly about what to do with your calling card, with your leaflet, but you can do. For those of us who went door knocking when we had that brief period where the restrictions were slightly lighter and before we went back in, the response on the doorstep was phenomenal. People were so pleased to see us. It was the most positive, uplifting canvassing I've done for ages. And in fairness, December in a Leave voting seat in the run up to the general election was not the most joyous experience. So reflecting on that, but we need to get doing stuff. There is a load of campaigning that you can do that is socially distanced, that's not knocking on doors. We should be emailing people regularly. We should be sending people Christmas cards if we haven't done that already. We can be phoning people for those people who said, here's my number and you can phone me on it. There's loads we can be doing. It's not just knocking on doors, but if you can knock on doors, do knock on doors.
And it was interesting listening to, again, to the Liz episode where she was saying, again, response she got was absolutely fine on the door. Even though, we talked a little bit about it, we're doing kind of soft canvassing now. It's not overtly political. If we are doing it, it's not in your face politics and throwing policy down people's throats. But even during her election, she got, obviously the SNP tried to make a little bit of aggro about it, as opposition parties will, but she said the reception was fine and she won. So, so it clearly didn't upset too many people. And I'll say, from our local party's point of view, we have been delivering throughout this last lockdown and not had a single complaint. Not a single one. So, and I think people really like the fact they're getting information. Right, next topic. Now, we are not going to talk about Brexit in this episode because we're running out of time, and actually we'll do another one in a week or so's time because it's changing on a daily basis, actually, what's happening with Brexit. I know a lot of our listeners and viewers care about it and want to know what the position is, and will the Lib Dems change their position if there's a no deal, all that sort of stuff. We will talk loads on Brexit in the future. But Laura, you wanted to talk about the Home Office.
Yes, well, I don't want to talk about the Home Office. I think I feel obliged to talk about the Home Office would be a fairer statement. I think we shouldn't let this episode pass without kind of reflecting on how horrendous it is that the Home Office was found guilty of racism, of breaking equalities law in the hostile environment. The report came out on the 25th of November, which is the 6-month anniversary of the death of George Floyd in the US, which of course triggered those enormous Black Lives Matter protests over the summer and caused a lot of us to kind of reflect on racism in our society and what we need to be doing about it. And I think I was quite surprised and shocked that actually that report didn't have more of an impact. And actually, even in this year, where there are so many things going on and competing for attention, particularly with the pandemic and with Brexit, it kind of didn't make that much of a ripple. And I think the main reason for that is that actually none of us were that surprised, because we know that the Home Office has been discriminating against people for years. Their decisions have been appalling. A huge proportion of their decisions are overturned on appeal. And of course, we saw with the Windrush scandal that, as many as 80 people who were British were deported. I don't know, is it deported if you're actually British? I mean, should we say deported or should we say exiled? I don't know. Transported to countries that they'd left at, sometimes as toddlers. And it's, turns out, says the Equalities Commission, that it's not a coincidence that these people were Black. And that is absolutely horrendous. It's absolutely horrendous. And it should be a really, really big scandal. We should have seen a ministerial resignation, but it didn't make a splash because we all know that they've been doing this. And I think it is something that we need to be talking about a lot more. And as a party, it's something that we do have quite a strong position on. We've argued certainly at the last election, possibly the election before that visa processing should be moved to BIS, which would, at least take some of it out of the Home Office. There's sort of some discussion, in the party about whether we should be campaigning to abolish the Home Office altogether. My view is that we shouldn't. I think it would, sound sort of unduly extreme, a little bit like your kind of defund the police slogan in the US, and just put people off. And also, I think we shouldn't be doing that because I think it lets politicians off the hook. These are decisions that people made, starting with Theresa May, but actually even going back into the Labour government before that. And actually we need to be focusing on those political decisions, but I think it's something that we need to be talking about and making sure that it is in the public eye, because it's absolutely horrifying finding. And when we think about, we had a podcast over the summer where we talked about what Black Lives Matter mean in this country, and I think perhaps this is a big part of it. And yes, police reform, stop and search, and all of this are things that we need to keep talking about, but actually sort of not deporting people because of the color of their skin would be a really good place to start.
That's a fairly low bar to start at, really.
It is a pretty low bar to start at, but it turns out our country is not clearing it.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting in a way how we get this approach forward, because what you're saying, it's not just one thing. It's a systemic kind of cultural thing within Britain that, and I think what happened with the summer protests and the Black Lives Matter protests is that it's all too easy for us just to drift with it. Particularly, I mean, we are three white people, and we ourselves, we've talked about this on the podcast about trying to get more diversity on it, because it's easy just to drift and let things slide when actually we have to be proactively trying to change. And if any listeners and viewers haven't listened to our racial diversity campaign episode with Josh and Addy, then please do, because it's really, really good, and some of the work they're doing is fantastic. But Lisa, what else should the party be doing on this?
Yeah, I was glad you mentioned that, because it's all of our job. It's not just the racial diversity campaign's job to fix racism and, I guess, laziness about these issues in the party. I think it's everybody's job. And I think that was one thing that when Vince was leader, he talked about a lot that we need to do better, and that we need to sharpen up a lot more, and we need to be much more proactive. And I think that's right. It's not somebody else's job to make this work. We all need to think about our local parties, our slate of candidates, the candidates in winnable seats, not just having somebody on a ballot paper, because then we've ticked that box. What are we doing, all of us, to do better as a party? I think we reflect society in some ways, but I think we need to strive to do much better than that. Society is racist. I think there is racism all around us, but we need to work much harder as a party, as a group of people, to sharpen up our act on it, definitely.
But I also think we can be talking about immigration more in general as well. There's quite, this is an area where I think, as long as I can remember having any interest in politics, when I was getting interested in politics, it was, the Labour government, and I'd be watching Question Time, and you'd have like a series of serious people coming on and being like, well, we have to be allowed to talk about immigration, and people have legitimate concerns. And they never actually went on to talk about immigration. So actually, we need to be, and I think we've all been afraid to talk about immigration, and we shouldn't be. Actually, I think we need to be coming out and saying that actually the Liberal Democrats are in favor of allowing people to move, and that we need immigrants to come to this country, bringing, whether it's at all levels of the economy, whether it's care workers or whether it's sort of scientists who are sort of driving our economy. And that's a core part of who we are as a country now. It's massively enriched us culturally. Like, how many of us has ever had an Indian takeaway on a Friday night? If you haven't ever done that, then okay, fine. You get to want to pull up the drawbridge, but I think most of us have. It's just who we are as a country now, and I think that's something that we as Liberals we want to celebrate, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. And I think it's also something where there's potentially some political capital there as well, because we can see in survey data that the public is becoming more positive towards immigration. Especially the groups that are sort of disposed towards voting Liberal Democrat. And it's an area where Labour are sort of never going to be willing to kind of make much headway, because they're very divided on the issue. So I do think it's an area where we could be talking about more, and just actually trying to, yes, let's talk about immigration. And let's talk about the benefits that immigration can bring. Let's talk about the fact that, you should be able to fall in love with whoever you want and move back to your home country, even if even if you don't have a lot of money. Let's talk about asylum seekers and refugees. Like, actually, let's talk about it, because it's important and no one else is.
Yeah, and I think I just got to show you have to fight for this stuff. You can't, again, you can't just drift and let it be. And it's, again, on immigration, you think now of all times, when you think of the pandemic and how many foreign workers in the NHS or in our care homes have really kept the system going and have sometimes paid with it with their lives. And yet we're still having to fight in a parliamentary sense to make sure these people have right to remain after whatever happens with Brexit. And the fact that is still needing to be fought for, despite what's happened this year, just shows you actually why the Lib Dems do need to exist and why we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it. Because if we don't, I don't know if the other parties will. So that's a to all of us, all our listeners. Don't be afraid to talk about immigration. I grew up in the whitest of white areas, in like a tiny farming village in West Cumbria. There was not a single ethnic minority student in any of my schooling until I came to university. And yet there was still issues with immigration and fear of immigration in Cumbria. It's all our jobs to kind of talk about this. And because if you talk about it, it alleviates some of the fear and misinformation about it. So I'm going to leave that on a positive note. That's where we're going to leave the podcast this day, is go out and don't be afraid to talk about your principles, because if you don't talk about them, no one's going to care about it in the future. And I think that will kind of wrap up our episode. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Laura, for coming on. Do have a great rest of your day. Thank you to all our listeners for downloading or watching this on YouTube and Facebook. You can follow everything to do with the Lib Dem Podcast at Lib Dem Pod. Thank you to our sponsors, both Prater Rains and the Katura Coffee Club. Yes, it's fantastic now we're now getting sponsorship. Do go check out their websites. Do give them some support, because like we've talked about, coronavirus has had a real big effect on all levels of the economy. So do give them some appreciation for helping the podcast and supporting the podcast. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much for downloading, and we'll have another episode very soon.